What happens when the unthinkable occurs? What if the world spirals once again into the tumultuous depths of a global conflict? How would such an event shift the paradigms of nations and societies, disrupting the norms of everyday life and injecting an element of chaos where there was once order? These are the provocative questions we will delve into today in our exploration of potential global conflict scenarios. Consider for a moment the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. An undeniable political and humanitarian crisis serves as a stark reminder of the devastating ripple effects of war. The turmoil, far from being confined within the borders of the affected, spreads outwards in waves, shifting the balance of power, disrupting economies, and altering lives in far-flung corners of the globe. Let's take a closer look at Egypt, a nation seemingly far removed from the Ukrainian landscape. This country, rich in history and culture, is presently grappling with skyrocketing food prices and escalating inflation. Its economy, once robust, now falters under the weight of these mounting pressures. You might wonder how a conflict thousands of miles away could have such a profound effect on a country apparently disconnected from the immediate impact zone. The answer lies in the intricate web of global trade and geopolitics. Egypt has long been heavily reliant on Ukraine and Russia for its wheat imports, a staple food for its populous nation. Due to the ongoing conflict, these once plentiful wheat supplies dwindled, turning an essential resource into a scarce and expensive commodity. This sudden shift in availability has caused a domino effect within Egypt's economic structure, leading to the issues we see today. A significant part is played by the Egyptian government, which is currently engrossed in a desperate scramble to find new grain suppliers to fill the void left by the Ukrainian and Russian exports. But who truly bears of this crisis? It is the common Egyptian citizen. They are the ones feeling the pinch of the soaring bread prices and the instability of their economy. They experience firsthand the consequences of a conflict happening far away from their homeland. And so, as the government scrambles to find new grain suppliers, it is the common Egyptian citizen who bears the heavy burden of the crisis. Now let's shift our gaze to a potential conflict between the United States and China. This is not a topic to be taken lightly, nor one that is easily brushed aside. We are, after all, discussing two of the world's leading superpowers, both of whom have significant political, economic, and military clout. Their every move on the global stage has ramifications that echo throughout the corners of the world. These ramifications aren't just limited to the military or the diplomatic arenas. Consider the global economic impact, a potential domino effect that could ensue if these two superpowers engage in conflict. The mere thought of such a scenario is enough to send shudders down the spines of global economists and political thinkers alike. It is crucial to understand that economies worldwide are intertwined, more so now than ever before. A significant part of these interconnected economies includes smaller, developing nations. Nations that, while they may not be major players on the global stage, are nonetheless heavily dependent on these superpowers for trade and aid. Think of countries in Africa, for instance. Many African nations, despite their ongoing struggles to strengthen their economies and secure their domestic stability, rely heavily on the United States and China, both for direct trade and for aid. Similarly, consider Southeast Asian nations. These nations too would be hit hard in the event of a conflict between the superpowers, as their fragile economies heavily rely on trade and foreign aid. The damage that could be inflicted on these nations in the event of a conflict is almost unimaginable. Their economies, already fragile and dependent on the goodwill and stability of larger nations, could face a catastrophe on a scale hitherto unseen. Trade routes, which form the lifelines of these economies, could be disrupted, their steady flow of goods and services effectively choked off. Foreign aid, the lifeline for numerous developing nations, could dry up, leaving them in a state of economic disarray. Indeed, the global impact of a conflict between the United States and China could be staggering. Countries in Africa and Southeast Asia, for example, could see their economies crumble as trade routes are disrupted and foreign aid dries up. What about Europe, though? The question inevitably comes to mind when pondering the potential repercussions of a war on European soil. Europe, with all its rich culture, history, and economic prowess, finds itself a precarious situation whenever a conflict, like the one we see unfolding between Russia and Ukraine, emerges. A war, at its core, is a chaos machine, creating ripples of uncertainty and fear that reach far beyond the immediate battlefield. In the context of Europe, these ripples could indeed translate into shockwaves, reverberating through the entire continent. Europe's intricate tapestry of interconnected nations suddenly becomes a liability, as the stability of one can easily undermine the tranquility of the others. In the case of a war within such close geographical proximity, the impact would be all the more profound. Europe isn't an isolated continent, it's a tapestry of nations, a web of interconnected economies, cultures, and politics. A war wouldn't just throw a single country into chaos, it would send shockwaves of instability, fear, and uncertainty rippling across the European continent. And what of the smaller countries? Particularly those located in Eastern Europe, these nations find themselves caught in the crossfire of larger, more powerful entities. These countries, many of them still nursing the wounds of past conflicts, could potentially be hit hardest. The proximity to the conflict alone makes them vulnerable. The proximity, coupled with their economic dependence on larger European powers, places these nations in an even more precarious position. The economic symbiosis that exists within the European Union means that a ripple in one economy could send waves through others. These smaller nations, already walking the tightrope of economic stability, could find themselves plunged into chaos. It is also worth noting that the fallout from such a conflict would likely exacerbate existing social, political, and economic tensions within these countries. And yet, through it all, the resilience of these nations and their citizens cannot be underestimated. The history of Europe is a testament to this resilience and to the spirit of unity that has allowed the continent to weather past storms. Yet, the potential for a warlike situation is a stark reminder of the fragility of peace. A war on European soil like the one we see unfolding between Russia and Ukraine could send shockwaves through the continent. Smaller countries, particularly those in Eastern Europe, would likely be hit hardest due to their proximity to the conflict and their economic dependence on larger European powers. On the other hand, nations isolated geographically and politically might fare better. New Zealand, for instance, due to its distance from major conflict zones and its self-sufficient economy, could be a relative safe haven. But it's important to remember that no country can fully escape the effects of a global conflict. War ripples out, affecting global trade, economies, and societies in ways that are often unpredictable. So, what have we learned today? Firstly, war has far-reaching consequences that extend beyond the immediate conflict zone. Countries like Egypt, far removed from Ukraine, can still feel the impacts of the conflict. Secondly, in a potential conflict between major powers like the United States and China, developing nations reliant on these superpowers could face significant economic hardship. Thirdly, Europe could experience severe turmoil in the event of a war, with smaller Eastern European countries likely suffering the most. Finally, while geographically isolated nations like New Zealand might be somewhat insulated, no country is entirely immune to the effects of a global conflict. The specter of war is a harsh reminder of our interconnected world. It underscores the importance of diplomacy and peaceful resolution in maintaining global stability. For in a world so intricately linked, the ripple effects of conflict touch us all, regardless of borders, oceans, or political alliances.